Before we jump into this week's message, just want to say thank you to Don for filling in last week, preaching last minute as my family and I had to go back to Texas to deal with a unfortunate tragedy in our family. And I also want to say thank you to you for understanding, for praying for us. A lot of you have reached out. Even this morning, people said, "Pastor, I'm praying for you." That means the world because, as a leader, you're always feeling like you're shouldering, the burdens of the people and what's going on in everybody else's life. But then when things are happening in your own life, it's at times hard to ask for help. And that's always personally, that's just a tough thing, to be vulnerable, to talk through that. So me even saying this to you now is a part of my own growth because it's been a very difficult season for my family, not just with this, but over the last several months dealing with a lot of things within the church, outside the church, personally, and all that kind of stuff. And so you kind of reach these moments where you feel like you got nothing left but God to help you. And God does that through his church and through people. And so thank you. From our family, I just want to say thank you. It means the world to us. Thank you. I appreciate that. James chapter 1 says to count it all joy when you face trials of many kinds because it produces steadfastness in you. And that steadfastness has to have its way with you. And so you can be perfect and mature. But anybody, as I know a lot of you have, when you're going through trials, that's the last thing you feel is joy. But it's knowing that God's got you in that. And it's no coincidence that we're preaching through James, and that's the first part of the book. And so the joy comes in the morning, right? The joy comes when you see that even through that stuff, God is sovereign, he is involved, he has not let you down, and he holds you. And so it's been amazing to see God in the midst of it as well. So if you have a Bible, open it up to James chapter 3. We're closing this out. But before we do, on a high note, I just want to celebrate. I know Corey was out here a minute ago. He was telling you what God did this week. I just want to take a moment before we jump into the message while you're turning there, and just to praise our student staff, Corey, Jenna, all of our team members, all of our team leaders, so many adults, so many people served this last week, over 40 leaders. God just did an amazing thing this week at our student camp. And so I just want to publicly say to you to hear from me how grateful I am for our team, for our leaders. Man, it was just an amazing week. I spoke Thursday night myself. I was there for some of the other sessions, hearing what God was doing. And God just broke through some students' lives this week, Thursday night, and every night really. But obviously, it was just this, it was just amazing thing. Literally, students all week long who just denying God, coming up Thursday night, just bawling, couldn't even hardly get words out, saying, "I trusted Christ for the first time." And when you see God moving like that, man, that is what gets you fired up. That is what you say, okay, God is moving even in the midst of the trials. God's moving even in the midst of circumstances. And so I just want to say thank you to all of our amazing, let's give it up for them, all of our amazing student staff, leaders. Man, if your student went this week, man, write a note of thank you to them, to their leaders, to whatever, bless them. Man, let's get fired up about what God is doing there. I love teenagers. I love our students. I pastored students for a lot of years. I may rag on them at times, but that just, any man who's been in a locker room before knows you make fun of the people you love the most, right? And so I love our teenagers. I love our students, and I believe in what God is doing with them. They're not the church of tomorrow. They're the church of today. And what is happening with them is just amazing. And that's all a part of what God's doing in our church. So thank you. Thank you so much for believing in students and believing in us to help pastor your students. So let's jump in James chapter 3. We're going to end out this chapter in James chapter 3. Not a lot of verses 13 through 18, but a lot is packed in to these short amount of verses. And let's jump in starting in verse 13. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom." So let's just look at this one verse here for a second. So it's on the screen by itself, and we read it again. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. Now, James is not asking the question like in a derogatory term, saying, is there anybody wise among you? Is there anybody that really has it all together among you? Is there anybody among you that's understanding? Although they would have been new Christians, obviously a lot of scholars believe that James was the very first New Testament book written. And so this came very quickly after Christ had ascended, the church had grown, they were persecuted. And then James is writing to people who had been sent out from Jerusalem. And so they would have invariably been new believers, for sure. But James is not calling them out. He's not saying, is there anybody wise among you? Is there anybody understanding among you? He is asking a question so that he can answer it. And this is his answer. And so his setup is to say, if somebody is wise, if somebody is understanding among you, you're gonna know that they're wise. You're gonna know that they have understanding by how they live their life. He says, let him show his good conduct by his works. That phrase there, good conduct, literally means the way of life. Your way of life, your behavior. This has been the message of James. The message of James is saying, listen, your words, although they matter, Don talked about last week, it's hard as heck to control your tongue, right? But your words matter, but what really shows that you believe what you say is your works. It's how you live your life. It's the way you live your life. And so the argument that James has been making all the way through is saying, listen, it doesn't matter as much about what you say, what matters is how you live. If how you're living is not matching up with what you're saying, although it is important what you say, if how you're living is not matching up with that, then you are a hypocrite. You're not as wise and understanding as you think that you are. And this phrase here, way of life, it occurs a couple other places. One of them is one of my most favorite verses. And by favorite, I mean it's a hard one. Hebrews 13:7, it's on the screen, I'll just read it to you. But Hebrews 13:7 says this, remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. So that would be directly talking about me. Now listen to this next phrase. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. What that means is, as a leader who preaches the word of God, I have to consider the outcome of my way of life. I have to consider it. I have to look at, that's what wisdom is. Wisdom is inspecting. Wisdom is looking at the fruit of, saying, okay, if I make this choice, if I live this way, if I continue to behave like this, what is the outcome? Where's this headed? Where's this going? And so a wise person is one who considers his way of life or her way of life. But this verse says, listen, you as the church are to consider my outcome, the outcome of my way of life. That is incredibly daunting for me to think about. I mean, imagine that. Imagine the feeling of thousands of people considering how you live, the decisions that you make, the choices that you make, the words that you say, the things that you tweet, the conversations that you have, the places that you go. This is why James says, listen, not many of you should be teachers. Because when you teach, you invariably invite scrutiny into your life. And that's tough. That's tough. But yet that's the call. The call is not just for leaders, but for everybody to say, you know what, I need to consider the outcome of my way of life. How I'm living, how I'm behaving. Is this going to lead to a place that honors God? James says, if you're wise and understanding, then what you're gonna do is you're gonna consider the way of your life. You're gonna have good conduct, and you're gonna live your life in such a way, he says this, in meekness of wisdom. Now this word meekness, it always gets a bad rap. I remember the message Chad did years ago on this. We brought a Porsche car on stage, that's online, you can go watch it. One of the most memorable messages, because people always remember that there was a Porsche race car on the stage. But meekness gets a bad rap a lot of times, and especially To the Greek people in this environment where a lot of this took place initially, to a Greek person, meekness was weakness. It's what servants did. It's what people who were lowly did. They served other people. And so meekness, or we might say humility, was not a value in the ancient world. What's amazing, you can go do a word study on this, it is not until Jesus comes on the scene that humility actually becomes a virtue. Go back and look at the etymology, which is just the root of a word. You go back and look at that, it was seen as a negative until Jesus came along. And when Jesus came along, the meaning of the word meekness or humility took a drastic turn because now it's seen as strength under control. And so what James is saying, listen, if you are going to be wise, if you're gonna have understanding, then the way you act, the way you conduct your life is gonna be typified by humility and wisdom. You're gonna live your life wisely and you're gonna live your life humbly. That's the goal. The goal is to live in such a way that our conduct proves our wisdom, that our way of life proves our wisdom. We live in a day and age where everybody has a voice. Everybody. Social media is not the problem, people are the problem. We can't blame social media, we gotta blame people. But what has happened with social media, it's given everybody a microphone, a megaphone. And just being honest, right? A lot of people shouldn't have that microphone or megaphone, right? But we can talk about that about other people, but let's be honest, you shouldn't have it either probably, right? Most of the time. We're evil people. And we so rush to an online platform just to get our words out there when used to we would write them down in our journals or we would actually pray them, right? And so what happens a lot of times is we give everybody these megaphones, these mouthpieces, and we wanna talk like we're wise. We want everybody to know our opinions or know what we're thinking when they shouldn't always know what we're thinking or our opinions. And what James is saying, listen, it actually harms you when you take that kind of approach because the person who's always saying that they are wise is really not wise. Because the wise people are the ones who are the most humble. And are humble people talking about how humble they are? Man, you know what? All you people should be humble like me. Man, if you were just more humble like me. I remember being in seminary and one of the theological jokes is I think it's the book of Numbers, but it's at the very end, to believe Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, but at the very end of Moses' life, the Bible says this, and Moses was the most humble man that ever lived. Well, Moses could not have written that. Wrote that. I'm not near as wise. Because if Moses wrote that, then he wouldn't be the most humble person that ever lived, correct? So scholars believe that was a later editorial ad, which doesn't make the Bible wrong, it doesn't make it incoherent, doesn't make it insufficient in any way. What it means is when they were putting that together, they said, look at Moses' life. He was humble. He was a servant of God. He lived his life in meekness, in wisdom, under the authority of God. He did what God said for him to do, even when it was hard for him to do. And so Moses was humble, he was meek, he was strength under power, under control. And so if I say I'm humble, then I'm not humble. If I say I'm wise, then I'm not wise. So how do you know if I'm wise? How do you know if I'm humble? You watch how I live. How do I interact with people? When people talk to me, when people have conversations with me, when people interact with me, how do I listen? Do I listen twice as much as I talk? James 1. Do I show partiality or favoritism? James 2. Am I rude with my tongue? James 3. You see how all this is building? He's saying, listen, this is all a matter of wisdom. This is all a matter of humility, because if we're not living in humble kind of servitude of others, then we're actually doing the exact opposite of what God has called us to do. In fact, that's where he goes next. Look at verse 14 through 16. He says, but if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambitions in your heart, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Now, that's a mouthful. Let's unpack that for a few minutes. James is making the argument that says, listen, your wisdom is shown by your works. Just like he said in chapter 2, your faith is shown by your works. You could use faith and wisdom almost interchangeably here, because that's how James is using them. It's all shown by your works. And so if wisdom and humility and faith is shown by your works, then it matters how you live. And now he's saying, but if you live with envy, selfish ambition, just let me read you what these words mean. Bitter jealousy is a particularly strong feeling of resentment and jealousy against somebody. Bitter hostility, proceeding from or exhibiting great hostility or animosity. So if you're a person that harbors resentment, if you're a person that harbors bitter jealousy, that holds grudges against people, if you're a person that walks out on a relationship just because somebody made you mad, just because somebody upset you, I mean, we are just perpetually offended people in today's world. Perpetually offended about something. Can I just tell you something? People are going to offend you for the rest of your life. And I'm just talking about your spouse, your kids, Christians. It always bugs me when people say, I thought they were Christians. Well, hold on, Christian. If you can't forgive that person, then you may not be Christian. You're holding resentment towards that person that hurt you. It says, listen, if your way of life is bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, let me give you the definition of that. A strong drive for personal success without moral inhibitions. What that means is this: if you go after success at all costs, you'll run people over, you'll step over people, you'll step on people, you'll throw people under the bus. Just for your own personal gain, if that's the type of way of life you have, bitter jealousy, resentment, harboring bitterness, looking out for number one, which is you, because if you don't look out for you, nobody else looks out for you. If that's your way of life, you know what he says? He says, listen, that's not wisdom that comes down from above. Amazingly, wisdom that comes down from above, I think, is a reference to the fact that God descended in the person of Jesus Christ. He came down. So if you want to know what wisdom looks like, look at the one who is God, who came from God and lived among us. Let me say it like this: compare your way of life to Jesus's way of life. And what James is saying is bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, that didn't come from God. It didn't come from God. That's not of God. Because that's not how Jesus was. People say, I just want to see God. Look at Jesus. The good news is the Father is just like Jesus. You want to know what God is like? Read about Jesus. You read about Jesus and how he lived and how he loved. The good news of the gospel is that's what God is like, because Jesus is God. But then he goes even further, and hear me, I want us to feel this. He says, not only is it not from above, look at back what he says in verse 15, but is earthly. That word earthly means this. It means a characteristic of this earth as distinguished from heaven. It's a negative sense, suggesting a narrow perspective that fails to consider God's realm and God's will. It's of this earth. It's not of that one. It's not of heaven, it's of this one. Then he says this, secondly, it's unspiritual. This is characterized by a created, finite, and fallen world. Perhaps also of the nature that humanity shares with animals. It's unspiritual. You acting like animals, which always amazed me. We tell people they come from monkeys. We shouldn't be surprised when they act like monkeys. We're just humanistic. There's no spirit. This is one of the biggest problems with humanistic people. You have to ask yourself, where does the value, the human ethic of love come from? Why am I supposed to deny myself and love you when you are a threat to my very existence? Why should I not eat you before you eat me? The survival of the fittest, right? And it's amazing that people want to have that and they want to have moral good. You can't have both. That's what it means to be unspiritual. Literally, where human feeling and human reason reign supreme in contrast to the spirit. So envy, bitterness, unforgiveness, jealousy, selfish ambition, it's of this world, it's not of heaven. And then thirdly, he says this, it's demonic. That's a characteristic of spirits in rebellion to God. I wrote in my notes in all caps, whoa. This type of wisdom is of this earth, finite and fallen, just like demons. We need to really feel this because this is a matter of acting like demons and therefore is a matter of ultimately salvation. You know what James is saying? When we act with bitter jealousy and resentment and try to tear people down by our own selfish ambitions instead of building people up in humility and meekness and love, when we act like that, you know who we're acting like? The devil. This is why Jesus in John 8 told the religious leaders of his day, now you need to hear this, the religious leaders, those who were in charge of the temple, the chosen people of God out of the Old Testament, Jesus said to them, my father is not your father is the devil. And your converts are twice the sons of hell that you are. Whoa. You wanna know why they killed Jesus? It's because he said stuff like that. He walked into church synagogues and told them they worship the devil. I wonder how many Christian people come into gatherings every week claiming to profess to love God, but then leave with bitter jealousy and resentment and tear people down, and they don't even realize they're an instrument of the devil. Whoa. So your inability to forgive is demonic. Our inability to serve is demonic. If we come to church every Sunday out of selfish ambition just to sit and soak and receive, that's demonic. The whole reason why we have a serving table out there is so that you can be less like demons when you come to church. Did you hear me? How's that a motivation to serve? Like, dang, I don't want to be demonic. But listen, if you're new, again, especially if today's your first time, I want you to understand I do talk like this often, but it's because I love you. But if you're new and you're just figuring our church out, that's okay. It takes time. Relationships are messy. I get all that. But if you've been receiving for months and years, and it's still about your own selfish ambition, you're just not as wise as you thought. You're not as Christ-like as we want you to be. So you know why we ask you to serve? Because it aids in your growth. We ask you to get into a group because it aids in your growth. We ask you to obey the commands of Christ because it aids in your growth. Everything we ever ask from you is because we're asking something for you, on behalf of you. We want you to know this. We want you to hear this. This is why I ask you to give and tithe. People always get upset, and I understand when I talk about that because I'm talking about your idol, your hero, your trust. I'm talking about your God. But what I'm telling you is that is demonic if we don't obey. So we've kind of created this what we call carnal Christians, where they believe but they don't obey. They're kind of in the middle. Jesus said, you know what I do with those folks? Sorry, front row. I should spit this way next service. I spit you out. Listen, Christians, Jesus said he would rather you be cold than lukewarm in the middle. He said, I would rather you be unsaved and quit acting. If you have no willingness to act like me, if you're not constantly measuring your way of life against Christ. This is one of the things that bugs me about church people. I just gotta be honest. They're always measuring someone else's spirituality instead of their own. Always talking about where other people are instead of first in humility saying, I'm the worst sinner on the planet. I got no right. You want to know the hardest part about my job and our pastors and our staff's job is pastoring sinful people knowing how sinful we are. This is why if there's anybody on our staff that is arrogant in how they pastor you, I want to know that because I want to root that out because that's not of God. That's of the devil. Bitter, jealousy, envy, backbiting, resentment. What does he say? You know when that exists, what happens? Disorder of all kinds. This word here, it means to unsettle. You're unsettling the foundation of the church. You're creating a shaky foundation. Jesus talked about it on sand instead of on the rock. You wanna know why churches split? It's because they built it on the wrong stuff. And so you and I, we have to always be fighting for the order. Paul said in Corinthians, listen, God's not a God of disorder, he's a God of order. That's why your services should have order to them. That's why you shouldn't just let it just be this free-flowing thing. Everybody's speaking in tongues, nobody knows what the mess they're saying. Not saying it's bad to speak in tongues, like, no, there needs to be order. God is a God of order. And when there's disorder, when there's unsettling, where there's disunity, you can trace it back to one thing, the work of the devil. It's demonic, it's unspiritual, it's earthly. And it's coming out in people's resentment and bitterness and selfish ambitions. He says, in every vile practice. Listen, the reason why I'm saying this is because what I want for our church more than anything, I want our church to grow. Of course, I want more people to know Jesus. But you know what I want more than anything? And when I say church, I mean you and me. I want our church to look like Jesus. That's what I want. I want my life to look like Jesus. That's it. Every desire has to come through that. Verse 17. Let's get to the positive. So what is the wisdom that comes from above? Verse 17, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. James, says the wisdom that doesn't come from above looks like this, but the wisdom that does come from above looks like this. And he says this, it is first and foremost pure. Most scholars believe that is the summarizing word. It's pure, and then the next 7 things he says describe what pure means. Because if something is pure, it means it's possessing all the qualities of. Everything's there. So if you're gonna have a pure wisdom, it's gonna be described by these 7 things. So let's look at these 7 things quickly. Peaceable, characterized by or promoting a state of wholeness, well-being, and happiness. It is after making others whole, not tearing up. Let me ask you a question. Is your motive in life to build others up or tear them down? Do you wake up every day thinking, how can I make someone else whole? W-H-O-L-E, complete. How can I fill somebody who's empty today? Do you realize that every interaction that you have with another human being, you're either depositing into them or you're withdrawing from them? And the key to life is having more people who deposit into you than withdraw, right? So you're not running on empty. This is why marriage is such a beautiful picture of the church. If the husband's depositing into his wife, the wife is depositing into her husband. Guess what? Both are full and both can draw because they're both receiving. But when does a marriage turn toxic? When both just focus on receiving and withdrawing and quit depositing. That's what's wrong. That's not peaceable. That's not after the wholeness of another person. So the first thing about a pure wisdom is it's after the wholeness of others. Second, gentle. What a great word. Merciful, forbearing, tolerant. Tolerant has been hijacked by our world. Because you have people that preach tolerance and yet they are the most intolerant person. If you do not agree like them, then they rally against you. My friends, that is not tolerance, that's tyranny. Tolerance means I tolerate you. I allow for the differences. I'm gentle with you. And yet the church is supposed to exhibit that because Christ exhibited that. I mean, my goodness, look at Christ's life. Just his 3 years of ministry. How much did he have to put up with? Over and over again, his disciples, he's like, oh, you guys don't get it. Oh my gosh. But yet he was gentle with them. Next one, it says open to reason. This word literally means persuadable. I love this commentator's opinion. Willing and open to adopting another position, belief, or course of action. Willing to yield. A willing difference to others when unalterable theological or moral principles are not involved. Here's what this means. We're not persuadable on the closed hand issues of truth. Jesus is the only way, the Trinity. The Bible's the inspired word of God. The church is God's plan A. We submit ourselves to the authority of Scripture. Those, we're not open to being persuaded about. But you know what I've realized? One of my pastors that had been a mentor in my life for many years tweeted this last week. He said, the older I have grown, or the older I've gotten, he said, my core beliefs have gotten smaller because what used to be so important, I realize is not as important. He said, but my love has gotten bigger. And I thought, you know what? That's typically the exact opposite of people who've been in church for 30 years. Their list of non-negotiables grows. You can't drink, you can't dance, you can't smoke, you can't hang with people who do. You can't, you know what I'm saying? Now I'm making fun of my Baptist brothers and sisters, because I is one. And their love shrinks. Is that not typically what happens? Bitterness grows, love shrinks. And that's an indictment on us as believers who have been believers longer. Our love should be growing and our core convictions should be stronger. This is why Jesus says, listen, greater love has no man than this, to lay down his life for his friends. Jesus harped on love, harped on it. That's what this is about. I struggle with this, I gotta be honest with you. I'm an idea person, I love ideas. I've never had an idea I didn't like. You know what I'm saying? That's just me. You give me a problem, I can give you 5 ideas almost within seconds. I just see it, it's a gift. We call it seeing around the corner. And so when I'm in conversations with somebody, I just think my idea is the best. But you know what? I have to be open to reason. If it's not a theological issue, if it's not a core moral principle, you know what? I need to listen. Because guess what? Maybe their idea is better. Or maybe with my idea and their idea combined, it could be better than either one of us could alone. That's the kind of wisdom that comes from above. He continues, and we gotta hurry. Full of mercy. Mercy, leniency, compassion shown towards offenders by a person or agency of authority. Full of mercy. Full of it. Listen, we are called to be full of mercy. When our mercy is running low for people, that should be a warning light on our dashboard. Hey, this is not wisdom that comes from God. So what that means is we gotta do what Jesus did. We gotta get along with God. We gotta receive from God. We gotta get with God. We gotta get with his word. We gotta get with his people. We gotta get with worship. We gotta let God fill us and receive, because the wisdom that's coming out of our mouths right now, that's coming out of our hearts towards other people, is demonic, not Christ-like. So if you're not full of mercy, get full of mercy. Well, how do I get full of mercy, Pastor? Receive mercy from God. You know how you receive mercy from God? Recognize that you're just as bad of a sinner as the person you're mad at. When you recognize that, you'll have no problem having mercy on them. Why? Because you realize God had mercy on you. Good fruits. Also full of good fruits. Fruit ultimately is other people who are changed by the wisdom we possess. You know, the fruit of your life is other people. That was one of the great joys of my life this week, and I even said it to the students when I was at camp. Corey, our student pastor, who's 25 years old, a lot of you know this, but I say it often. He was one of my students when I was in Texas doing student ministry. And I remember having conversations with his dad when Corey was a young teenager about the direction of Corey's life. And his father being very concerned, because Corey would tell you this, was headed down a dark path. And I'll never forget being in a Suburban, coming back from a staff meeting, and him just pouring out his heart with me. And I said, you know what? We're gonna go after him. Corey loved music, so we got him in our student band. And guess what? Lo and behold, God got his heart, saved him. And now he leads our students. And now my son, who's 13, sits under the fruit of what God did then. 39 students trusted Christ this week. That's the fruit of your life. I'm not trying to brag about my fruit because that's all God, but here's what I want you to see. If there's no fruit, there's no good fruit of people coming to Christ, then we're doing it wrong. We're doing it wrong. Lastly, impartial. The person characterized by wisdom from heaven will be stable, trustworthy, transparent. The kind of person consistently displaying the virtues of wisdom and on one whom can rely for it, advice and counsel. Sincere, I love this one. Unhypocritical, not pretended, is sincerely felt and expressed. That's the wisdom that comes from above. That's the type of works we're called to do. That. And when we do that, guess what happens? Look at verse 18 and we're done. Verse 18. And a harvest of righteousness. A harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. You know what I want to be? I want to be a peacemaker. Early on in my life, I'll never forget my mom. My mom, she loved trinkets. You had to be careful what you told my mom you liked, because then she'd buy it all for you. One time I made a comment, I like Three Stooges. That year for Christmas, I got everything Three Stooges. So my mom always was looking for stuff, meaningful stuff. I was like, Mom, gift cards are great. She hated that. And I'll never forget, she gave me this placard. It wasn't long after I trusted Christ, and it had my name, Jason, on it. And you've seen those things where they tell you the meaning of your name. And I don't know if it was true or not, but on the bottom it said peacemaker. That's what my name means. And my mom used that as an opportunity because I had just trusted Christ to tell me, Jason, this is who you are. And you know, at 13, I'm not fully leaning into that. I'm just trying not to smell and, find a girlfriend. But the more that I've lived my life, I have thought, you know what? That's what I want to be. Ultimately, I want to be the kind of person that makes peace with God and sinners. I want to be the kind of person that works to bring peace to people spiritually, eternally, because they're at enmity with God. They are God's enemy, but he sacrificed and died for them. So I want to live my life in such a way where I am having wisdom and I'm conducting my way of life so that sinners can be reconciled to a holy God through Christ who made peace on their behalf. That's what I want to do. And then secondly, as a peacemaker, if you know me, you know I can't stand when people aren't getting along. I feel like I was doing marriage counseling all the way through my life and my family. And it just prepared me for pastoral ministry. People say, when did you become a pastor? Well, really, since I was born, because it's just been part of what I've done in my family. I'm always trying to bring people together and make peace. And I'm not perfect at that by any means. But you know what the Bible is saying? When your goal is to make peace with God and people, and then through that with people and people, you will reap a harvest of righteousness. But only if you sow in peace. Think about it. I can't get peace if I don't sow peace. Galatians 6 says, the law of sowing and reaping, you will reap what you sow. So let me say something to you. If you are reaping bitterness, then you're not sowing peace. If you are reaping relationships of resentment and bitterness, then you're not sowing peace. But when we sow peace, we will reap righteousness. And who doesn't want righteousness? Righteousness is the core quality of who God is. But the promise is if we sow it, we'll reap it.